Okay. All right. So today I wanted to look at what evidence-based practices might be and sort of frame this week's work for us in the class. So I want to start with this that comes from Vanderbilt University. And Vanderbilt University has a center on teaching and learning that is really very well regarded. And there's a lot of work that's come out on best practices for working with especially students with learning disabilities and difficulties. And it's very clear to them, I even just use the term best practices, that for them, the term best practices is often too vague. It doesn't have a precision. So when we use the term best practices, we might be talking about things that are popular or trendy, things that we sort of prefer to do, or that maybe align with our philosophies of curriculum and instruction. These best practices probably do align pretty well with some of those philosophies, especially things like the Reconstruction philosophies and the self-actualization philosophies. And so you can see how best practices is a term that we really has become widely popular. And it's an umbrella term. But another term that indicates more precision and that I want to make sure that you understand the difference of would be evidence-based. So evidence-based practices, these are practices that have high quality research behind them. So yes, what we constitute a high quality research is probably something that has to go through some subjective nature, right? I can reject something as being of too low quality, perhaps because it didn't have enough participants in the study, or maybe it isn't quantifiable. So I'm a qualitative researcher. So for me, evidence-based practices is something that I don't really feel like I'm an expert in, because my type of research would often not be considered the type of research that would be conclusive enough to be able to go under the umbrella of evidence-based practices. Evidence-based practices, though, are something that are very rigorously considered, very much taken through a rubric of quantification, and it really comes almost like in a scientific mind. So, we talk about science or teaching as an art and the science of teaching. And I kind of think of best practices as in that art of teaching sort of umbrella, whereas the science of teaching is evidence-based practices. And so in today's video, I want to make sure, or by the end of this module this week, I want to make sure that you understand evidence-based practices and that you're able to distinguish those from things that we might identify as being best practices. So really the proponent of what I would identify as evidence-based practices, probably the most important voice is John Hattie. And so some of you that are in schools, you may hear John Hattie used a lot. You might hear the term visible learning. And what he did was he did something like over 800 meta-analyses looking at achievement, relating to achievement. And really what he's trying to identify are what are those practices and what are those sort of curricular decisions that really set students up for achievement that can be measured. And this is where, yes, John Hattie, you need to think about the fact that we're talking about achievement in terms of achievements that can easily be measured. So when we go back to last week's reading, when we're talking about something like self-actualization, that's not something that can be easily measured. And so John Hattie's work isn't going to inform something that is being shaped by the philosophy of self-actualization. But certainly curriculum as a technology, or when we look at some of the other ways that we could look at curriculum, academic rationalism, these are things that we might, that the evidence-based practices can really help to inform. I thought I would do this because of last week when we looked at Charlotte Danielson. So what he does is he takes a meta-analysis, he takes dozens of research on a practice, and he looks to see their effectiveness. What do these these multiple studies, quantitative studies. What do they reveal about the effectiveness of a teaching practice? And so I thought this was interesting before we go into some of the best practices or the evidence-based practices that he identifies. He actually did do a meta-analysis on what type of teacher has the highest achieving students. And what he found was that these are the characteristics that are most important to student achievement. Having teachers who are passionate about helping their students, having teachers who monitor their impact on the students' learning and adjust their approaches accordingly. So these are teachers that are using data to inform instruction. Having teachers that are clear about what they want their students to learn. So having teachers that really work on things like I can statements and learning objectives. Having teachers that forge strong relationships with students. So these can be measured by things like how students rate their comfort level and going to their teacher for help, going to their teacher with personal problems, things like that. So these are often rated by questionnaires. He also says that teachers that adopt evidence-based teaching strategies, it's a C below, sorry, I'll see after. These are very, very important and critical to developing, to creating a classroom where student achievement is going to occur. And then teachers that actively seek to improve their own teaching are the teachers. So this is, yes, it's self-reported, but what they found was in all these dozens of studies where teachers were self-reporting about their attitudes and aptitudes, or where students are reporting on their relationships and understandings of the teacher, then they also look at student achievement and student growth. And so what he's really known for, though, are the what he calls effect sizes. And so John Hattie, John Hattie looks at the effect sizes of specific teaching practices and evidence-based practices to look to see whether or not they are high, average, low, or negative. And so, for instance, and these are like the effects from the standard deviation. So this is how much of an improvement, how much of a gain practice demonstrates versus a control group that didn't have that practice. And then when we get down to the bottom, how much is lost with these practices. So for instance, classrooms where feedback is routinely given, that shows a high correlation to student achievement. Also, classrooms where student-teacher relationships are self-reported to be very strong and supported, high, one of the most important elements in achievement. Explicitly teaching study skills and cooperative learning, those get into what he would call average, okay? So those are average, average impact. Homework, individualized instruction, ability grouping, those start to get into the lower, right? So this debate about homework, that's coming, some of it's coming out of Hattie's work. And then when we start to move to things like that are of a negative impact, we see open versus traditional classes. Those are like the non-tracked things. Those those have little to no impact. And then we start to get negative when we start to look at things like, we know that retaining students for a year, that actually is counterproductive to student achievement. Which is obviously important information to have because obviously we would retain a student only if we thought that we were going to be improving their outcomes. And no surprise to any of us that have worked in schools with high transient student populations, shifting schools really has a strong negative correlation on student impact. So John Hattie has all of these studies that he does, and he continually updates them. He's been looking specifically now at technology, some of the technology pedagogy. So he looks at instructional practices and he tries to identify those ones that we can call evidence-based, okay? So this week, what your job is really going to be is to come to some personal understanding of the evidence-based practices. And so, a lot of these practices, while he's looking at them in terms of academic achievement, I do believe that the coaches will be able to find strategies that specifically you find relevant to your own teaching, to your own coaching. So one of the things you'll do is you'll read this very quick. This was an update that was done last year. So you'll do this very quick reading, and you'll see the impact scores, okay? And you'll be able to read a little bit more about some of these 10 evidence-based practices for 2021. So this is just kind of gives you a nice modeling of the what do you want to call it, the way that that John Hattie and his team developed their understandings of evidence-based practices. The next thing you're going to do is linked in Leo. I have a TED Talk by John Hattie. Why are so many of our teachers in school successful? Which is a TED Talk that Hattie gave that I'm going to have you watch on Leo. So from these two, good Lord, I'll fix that, because I did have another step and then I decided that that was too much. So you're welcome, but I should have fixed my slide. What I want you to do then is I want you to write a 2-page paragraph reflection on an evidence-based practice that you see as central to your teaching or coaching, and then post that to the discussion board. Okay, so I'll have a prompt on the discussion board. I'm saying 2 paragraphs because I want you to understand that this is going to be a substantial. Don't make this like a very, I'd like to see you quoting specifically aspects of John Hattie's from either the reading or the TED Talk. I want to see you. So the first thing I want you to do is explain the strategy itself, the evidence, and what evidence you and how the evidence seems to point to its impact. And then the second part, I want you to tell me from your own experiences, how do you see this evidence-based strategy impacting your student or athletic performance? Okay. All right. So that is what we're going to do this week. I'm going to stop sharing and stop recording. So thank you and have a good week.